You might come seeking solace, answers, or simply a trail to follow, but the woods will offer you something else, an encounter. Sometimes it's a gift of wild intimacy, sometimes a shiver of mystery that lingers long after you've returned to paved roads. Here are 10 such moments, plucked from the deep hollers, high balds, and laurel-snarled coves of Appalachia, each now expanded to its full, unhurried weight. 1. The train that wasn't there. It happened on a spur of the Appalachian Trail in southwest Virginia, not far from Damascus, in a fold of land where the forest floor is soft with a century's accumulation of pine needles. I had walked most of the day through a tunnel of green, the kind of day where your thoughts settle into the rhythm of your boots and the world contracts to the next white blaze. I pitched my tent in a small gap just as the light began to leach out of the sky, the first stars pricking through the canopy like distant pinpricks in a darkening fabric. The evening was still, the kind of stillness that makes the crack of a falling acorn sound like a gunshot. I ate a cold dinner, no fire, and fell asleep to the sound of a barred owl asking its rhythmic question across the ridge. Around 3 in the morning, I woke from a dreamless sleep to a sound I could not immediately place, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the very ground, vibrating up through my sleeping pad and into my sternum. It was a train whistle, but not the bright, assertive blast of a modern diesel. This was the long, drawn-out cry of a steam whistle, the sort you hear in old recordings or museum reenactments, full of hollow distance and antique sorrow. My rational mind, still sluggish, fumbled for an explanation. A distant freight line crossing the valleys, a trick of the wind funneling sound through the ridges, some local enthusiast running a tourist line I hadn't known about. I lay there, every nerve alert, listening to the echo roll out and fade into the dark. Then the whistle came again, louder this time, closer, and with it the unmistakable chuffing of a steam locomotive, the sharp release of pressure, the metallic groan of wheels negotiating a curve in the track. I sat up, my heart was pounding a fast, shallow rhythm against my ribs. There are no active tracks for miles in that part of the national forest. No rails, no beds, nothing but old logging grades long since reclaimed by oak and maple. And certainly, there are no steam engines hauling midnight freights through these mountains. The sound built until I could feel the ground trembling, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to pass right beneath my tent, as if some spectral engine was barreling through the gap on invisible rails. I scrambled for my headlamp, but by the time I fumbled it on and unzipped the fly, the noise had crested and begun to fade, receding down the valley like water swirling down a drain, leaving only the profound silence of a forest that had for a few moments forgotten to breathe. The next morning I broke camp in a daze and hiked down to a road crossing where an older hiker was taking a break on a log, his skin like tanned leather, his eyes pale and calm. I mentioned the sound, half expecting him to laugh. Instead, he nodded without surprise. "You heard the ghost train," he said, as matter-of-factly as if I'd mentioned rain. He told me about the narrow-gauge logging railroads that once laced these hills like veins in the early 1900s, hauling out the massive chestnuts and oaks. Accidents were common, boiler explosions on steep grades, runaway cars on slick rails, a misplaced switch sending an engine and its crew tumbling into a ravine so remote that the wreck was never fully salvaged, just swallowed by the mountain. They say when the fog is thick and the moon is right, you can still hear the old Shay locomotives working their grades, he said, squinting up at the ridge. The mountain doesn't forget what was taken from it. I've never found a historical record to confirm a specific wreck in that exact gap, but I know what I heard, the shriek of metal, the deep, rhythmic pulse of a steam engine, the melancholy cry of a whistle that seemed to be mourning its own vanished world. It wasn't a warning or a haunting in the traditional sense. It felt more like an echo worn into the landscape, a mechanical ghost memory of the mountain's flayed skin, still crying out in the dark for the trees that are no longer there to muffle the sound. 2. The bear at dusk. On a warm June evening in the Rhone Highlands, I was descending from a rudgeland carpeted with flame azaleas and Catawba rhododendron, blooms so vivid they seemed to smolder in the fading light, when I heard a rustle in the understory below. It wasn't the flippant scrambling of a squirrel or the startled retreat of a deer. This was heavy, deliberate, the sound of something large moving with a slow, muscular purpose that sends a wordless signal straight to the oldest part of your brain. I stopped, my hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my hip strap, though I didn't unholster it. A black bear emerged from a thicket of mountain laurel about 40 yards down the slope, its coat glossy as oiled leather, every movement a liquid flow of power. It was a mature animal, maybe 250 pounds, with a grizzled patch of fur on its chest and small, watchful eyes that immediately locked onto mine. We saw each other at the same moment. The bear halted, one paw still raised, its head lifting and swinging slightly as its nose read the air. Time performed that strange expansion you experience in the presence of something utterly wild and indifferent to your plans. I expected it to do what black bears usually do, huff, drop to all fours, and amble off with that rolling, unhurried gait. Instead, it held its ground. It stood on its hind legs, not in a bluff charge posture, but slowly, deliberately rising until it towered against the dying sun. I could see the individual droplets of moisture on its muzzle, the way its ears swiveled forward. It looked at me with an unsettling stillness, not the panicked evaluation of a startled animal, but something closer to. I searched for the word curiosity. Not benign curiosity, either. It was the kind of attention that felt like being weighed. I did what you're supposed to do. I made myself big, raised my trekking poles, and spoke in a low, firm voice. "Hey bear, I'm here, I'm leaving now." The bear did not react. It dropped slowly back to all fours, but instead of retreating, it began to pace parallel to the trail, its head swiveling to keep me in view. I started backing away, step by careful step, my eyes fixed on that dark shape moving through the goldenrod and fern. The bear followed, not closing the distance, but matching my pace exactly, a silent shadow slipping through the trees. I could hear its breath now, a deep, rhythmic chuff that was not aggressive, but was also not the sound of something ready to forget about me. After what felt like an eternity, probably 5 minutes, I reached a bend in the trail that would take me out of its line of sight. The bear stopped. It let out a sound I will never forget, a low, rumbling vocalization that started in its chest and seemed to resonate through the ground, not quite a growl, not quite a moan, something deeply communicative in a language I would never understand. Then it turned deliberately and melted into the dim green of the forest. I stood trembling, not just with the standard post-adrenaline shake, but with a profound, bone-deep unease. It had not been a threat encounter in the usual sense. It had felt like a test, or perhaps a message. The mountain's true owner letting me know that my passage was permitted, but only just and only this once. I hiked the rest of the way down in a headlong rush, the feeling of being watched trailing me like a cold hand between my shoulder blades until I reached the safety of the car. 3. The Still in the Laurel Hell. There's a place deep in the Puska National Forest, off any maintained trail, where the rhododendron grows so thick and twisted that locals call it a laurel hell. Sunlight barely touches the ground. It is always twilight in there, a greenish underwater dimness, and every step is a negotiation with the braided, muscular branches that snag your pack and claw at your clothes. I was bushwhacking, admittedly a bit lost, following a contour line that I hoped would lead me to an old road, marked on a 1930s topographic map I'd found in a library archive. The going was slow and punishing. My forearms crisscrossed with welts from branches that seemed to pull back just enough to snap forward and sting. I was about to give up and climb to a ridge for a GPS signal when my foot clanged against something metallic, a dull, resonant gong that meant buried treasure or buried junk. I cleared away decades of leaf mold, the soil dark and loamy and smelling of cool decay, and uncovered the unmistakable curved belly of a copper pot, green with verdigris and crushed slightly on one side as if something heavy had fallen on it long ago. My heart quickened. I began to brush away more debris, my hands trembling with the thrill of discovery, revealing a carefully constructed firebox made of flat river stones, now tumbled but still showing the soot-blackened interior where hickory fires once roared. A few feet away, half buried, were rusted barrel hoops and the collapsed wooden cribbing of a mash box, its oak planks soft as sponge but still holding their rectangular shape. A clear, cold stream, a prerequisite for any good operation, chattered just a few yards away, tumbling over moss-slicked boulders, and I could see where someone had cleverly diverted a small channel to feed a cooling worm that was now long gone. I sat on a mossy log, the green cushion yielding damply beneath me, and let the scene assemble itself in my imagination. 70 or 80 years ago, men in overalls and sweat-stained hats would have worked this spot in shifts, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the rhododendron leaves, steam carrying the sweet, corny scent of white lightening up into the canopy, a sentry posted on the ridge listening for the crunch of revenue boots on gravel. They would have been men with hard hands and harder lives, making a product that was both currency and defiance, a liquid rebellion against a government that taxed their corn and told them what they could do with their own copper and grain. You can still find these lost stills scattered through the southern Appalachians, on creek banks, in rock shelters under overhangs, their owners long gone, fled to Detroit textile mills or buried in church cemeteries under stones that are slowly sinking into the red clay. This one felt like a sacred ruin, a temple to a hardscrabble independence the mountains have always demanded and rarely repaid. I sat there for a long time, listening to the stream and the wind in the laurel leaves, trying to hear the echoes of voices, the clink of mason jars, the stamp of boots. Then I carefully covered the copper pot back up with leaves and duff, erasing all sign of my presence. Some ghosts prefer to sleep undisturbed, and this one had earned its rest. 4. The Foxfire Night. Deep in a cove forest in the Great Smoky Mountains, I experienced a darkness so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing against my eyes, not just the absence of light, but a positive, velvety substance that seemed to pour into every crevice of the world. I had deliberately decided to night hike a short, 3-mile loop without a headlamp, wanting to strip away the reassuring tunnel of white light and let my senses recalibrate to the world of the owl and the flying squirrel. It took about 20 minutes for my eyes to adjust, and even then I was navigating more by feel than sight. The trail was a faint ribbon of exposed earth underfoot, cooler than the surrounding leaves, visible only as a negative space carved through the dense black. I moved slowly, one hand outstretched, grazing the rough, deeply furrowed bark of old chestnut oaks and the smooth, cathedral columns of tulip poplars that rose into an invisible canopy. The forest was alive with sound, the trill of tree frogs, the whisper of bats slicing the air just above my head, the occasional far-off yip of a coyote, but my vision was useless, and that felt like a strange kind of freedom. Then I saw them, a constellation of faint, greenish-white lights glowing at the base of a decaying log just off the trail, a dozen tiny stars that had apparently fallen to earth and taken root in the rot. I knelt, breath held, my knees sinking into the damp leaf litter. Foxfire, the bioluminescent mycelium of certain fungi, probably Panellus stypticus or a species of Armillaria, feeding on the dead wood, transforming rot into a silent, cold fire. The glow was ethereal, the color of a distant aurora or the light from a deep-sea creature, pulsing so faintly that it almost vanished if I looked directly at it, only to bloom again in my peripheral vision. I crawled along the log and found more clusters scattered around the slope, patches of ghostly light blooming on fallen branches, on the undersides of bark slabs, a subterranean galaxy mapping the forest's hidden architecture of decay. There's an old Appalachian folk belief that foxfire marks the spot where a wandering soul has lost its way, a soul lantern left burning to guide the confused dead back to their resting places. Another says it's the visible breath of the earth itself, the mountain exhaling its slow, mineral patience. In that silent, living dark, it felt like both and neither. It was the forest's quiet metabolism made visible, proof that even the process of breaking down, of dying and returning to soil, is beautiful if you have the patience to watch it in the dark. The fungi were simply doing what they had done for millions of years, converting death into light, and I was a privileged witness, a mammal with a briefly opened eye. I stayed until my knees ached and the chill seeped through my pants, the cold of the mountain floor penetrating my bones, and then I rose and hiked on, the image of that otherworldly glow printed on the inside of my eyelids, getting me far more surely than any flashlight ever could. 5. The Copperhead's Lesson. I was hiking a sun-dappled trail along a creek in the Cherokee National Forest, my mind adrift on the surface of things, the warmth on my neck, the distant call of a pileated woodpecker hammering its territorial drumroll against a hollow snag, the way the light scattered into coins of gold on the trail. It was late spring, and the woods were at their most seductive, every new leaf a brilliant green, every breeze carrying the scent of wet stone and wild ginger. I was not paying attention to the ground. I was thinking about a conversation I'd had a week before, replaying it, revising my responses, trapped in the endless loop of human rumination. The trail was easy, almost too easy, and I had let my guard down entirely. My boot came down an inch from a patterned coil resting on a flat, sun-warmed rock, soaking up the early afternoon heat like a length of living copper jewelry. The snake did not rattle. Copperheads have no rattle, only a quiet, vibrating tail that buzzes in dry leaves, but it moved with a startling fluidity, a thick, muscular wave that recoiled into a defensive posture with the speed of a snapped rubber band. The head rose, wedge-shaped and perfectly steady, the vertical pupils, slits like a cat's, fixed on my ankle with an ancient, unblinking patience. My breath caught in my throat. The snake's body was stunning, pinkish-tan hourglasses banded across a russet ground, perfectly camouflaged against the leaf litter and stone, a masterpiece of cryptic coloration that rendered it nearly invisible until the very last instant. I froze, every muscle locked. My mind, suddenly crystal clear, catalogued the facts. A copperhead's venom is rarely fatal to a healthy adult, but it is exquisitely painful, a hemotoxin that liquefies tissue and leaves scars both physical and mental. This one was about 2 feet long, an adult in its prime, and it was coiled within easy striking distance of my bare ankle. I had been wearing low trail runners, stupidly. the seconds ticked by with the weight of hours. The snake's tongue flicked, black and forked, tasting my scent on the air. Mammal, predator, harmless threat if I behaved correctly. I slowly, very slowly, slid my foot back, then the other, never breaking eye contact with those vertical pupils. The copperhead remained coiled for a moment longer, its body a tense spring, a living lesson in boundaries and consequences. Then, as if deeming me sufficiently cowed, it unwound itself and slipped into a crevice between two rocks, disappearing so completely it was as if the stone had simply absorbed it, returning the snake to the mineral world from which it seemed to have been carved. I finished the hike with my eyes on the path, each step intentional, my mind no longer drifting through past conversations but utterly present, tuned to the frequency of leaf and root and stone. The mountain had gently, terrifyingly corrected my drift. "Pay attention," it whispered. "The beauty here can bite, and the line between a perfect afternoon and a life-altering mistake is the width of a copperhead strike." 6. The House of Hand-Hewn Logs. Off a neglected fire road in the Monongahela National Forest. A ghost of a house keeps its own counsel. You'd miss it entirely if you weren't looking for the right angle. The forest has been reclaiming it for decades, wrapping its green arms around the structure with the patient, implacable embrace of time. I found it by following a faint trace of a wagon road that appeared on an old survey map, a scar on the land now nearly healed. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees. 2 small rooms of American chestnut logs, hand-hewn with broadaxe marks still visible, now silvered with age and caved in at the roof like a sleeping animal's spine. The stone chimney stood as the only defiant sentinel, held together more by mountain laurel roots than the original clay mortar, a crooked finger pointing at the sky. I pushed through the overgrown doorway, my pack snagging on a tangle of grunbra. Inside, the floorboards had returned to earth, ferns and fumfluck growing in soft green mounds where a family once ate and slept by the fire. The silence inside that cabin was different from the forest outside. It was a domestic silence, thick with the residue of lives lived and births given and meals cooked, of winter winds rattling a door now long gone, of children whispering in the loft that had collapsed into a heap of punky wood. A single iron bedstead, rusted and broken, lay on its side in the corner, its scrollwork still visible under the flakes of orange decay. On the stone mantel, nearly obscured by a century of soot, someone had carved the initials, JT plus MT 1892. The letters were deep and careful, the work of a steady hand, and I traced them with my finger, feeling the rough grain of the stone and the surprising coolness that lingered even on a summer day. I tried to imagine them, a young couple maybe, building this cabin from the trees they felled, the man swinging the broadaxe while the woman stacked the logs, their hands hardening into tools themselves. Did they grow corn in the tiny clearing I'd passed, the one now filled with blackberry brambles? Did their children make up games in the creek, catching crawdads and salamanders? I found a small relic on what had been the hearth, a fragment of a blue glass bottle, the kind that held medicine or perhaps cheap perfume, its edges softened by decades of rain. I tucked it back into the ashes. There's a melancholy to such places, but also a strange warmth, a sense that the walls still hum faintly with the frequencies of the lives they once sheltered. The forest is full of these vanished homesteads, the bones of a subsistence culture that simply wore out against the rocky soil, the families moving on to mill towns or just fading into the generations. I left a small smooth stone on the mantel as a token of thanks, a habit I'd picked up somewhere, and stepped back into the living woods, carrying the couple's initials and the blue glass glint in my memory. 7. The Fog That Walked. Along the crest of the Blue Ridge near Shenandoah, fog is a constant companion. It rolls in from the Piedmont to the east, pouring through gaps like a slow white tide, or it rises from the valleys to the west as the heat of the day condenses against the cooler heights. But the fog I met that afternoon was different. It didn't drift in from anywhere. It formed in the middle of the trail, a white thickening of the air that seemed to generate from within itself, as if the mountain had exhaled a breath it had been holding for centuries. Within seconds, visibility shrank from a cheerful, sunlit green corridor to a milky 10 feet. The temperature plummeted, the sweat on my arms turning cold and clammy. The bird sounds that had been a cheerful backdrop moments before, a wood thrush's flute-like song, the chatter of chickadees, were sucked into a cottony hush so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat. I continued slowly, using the trail's rocky edge as a guide, my boots scraping against the exposed granite that marked the Rudgelun. The fog moved with a peculiar intent, not the passive drift of a weather system, but a roiling, swirling motion that seemed almost investigative. Tendrils of mist reached toward me and then recoiled, like fingers testing the air. In my peripheral vision, shapes began to form, a tall, wavering figure that dissolved as I turned my head, a darker patch that seemed to crouch and then straighten, only to melt back into the undifferentiated white. My mind, steeped in Appalachian lore, cycled through the possibilities. The white thing of West Virginia legends, a shapeless fog creature said to haunt lonely ridges, the murky mountain spirits that the old Scots-Irish settlers spoke of in hushed tones, beings that led travelers astray into sinkholes and cliffs. A deep, irrational dread welled up, the kind that bypasses logic and sits in the spine, the lizard-brain fear of being watched by something that has no face. The trail felt unfamiliar, warped, its familiar landmarks swallowed. I could not hear my own footsteps as if the fog were eating sound. I stopped, breathing hard, forcing myself to remember that I was on a well-marked path, that I had a GPS in my pack, that fog was just water vapor. But the feeling of a presence was overpowering. Then, just as abruptly as it had come, the fog opened. A deer path I hadn't noticed veered off to the right, a narrow slot in the underbrush, and for a moment the entire mass of mist seemed to pour down that path like water down a drain, a river of white streaming into the woods and vanishing. I was left standing on a bright, clear spine of rock under a blue sky, the sun warm on my face, the birdsong slowly returning. It had lasted perhaps 15 minutes. I saw no specters, received no revelation, but I understood something of the old stories more clearly. The forest can disorient you not just physically, but spiritually, wrapping you in a milky presence that feels unnervingly alive, as if the mountain itself were dreaming and you had briefly stepped into its dream. I hurried down the trail, glancing back often, until I descended below the cloud line into the ordinary, reassuring green of the hardwood forest. 8. The Hermit of Old Rag. The man appeared on the trail ahead of me as if he had coalesced from the granite, as if the rock itself had decided to stand up and take human form for a conversation. He was ancient, not in a fragile, stooped way, but dense, like a boulder that has been settled in one spot for millennia and has no intention of moving for anyone. His beard was a white tangle, matted in places, and his trousers were patched with scraps of canvas and what looked like old flour sacks. He carried no pack, no water bottle, no modern gear of any kind, only a carved walking stick of twisted mountain laurel, polished to a dark sheen by decades of palm sweat, and a metal cup dangling from his belt, dented and blackened by many fires. This was on a rugged, seldom used approach to Old Rag Mountain, well away from the crowded summit scramble where weekend hikers from DC queue up at the rock scrambles. The silence here was deeper, the trees older, the sense of isolation complete. I nudged, my heart doing a small, surprised stutter. He nudged back, his eyes a startling pale blue in a face the culk of cured tobacco, deeply lined like a topographical map of his own life. "Water's good up ahead," he said, his voice like gravel rolling downhill, slow and deliberate, each word placed with care. "Spring comes right out of the rock, cold enough to hurt your teeth." I asked, trying to be casual, if he lived nearby. He gestured vaguely at the ridge with his stick. "Up top winter, down bottom summer, got a place back in the hollow." He didn't say house, just place, and I understood that the word meant something different to him. A site, a territory, a relationship with a particular fold of land rather than a structure. He was perfectly at ease, a creature of the mountain ecosystem like the hawks circling overhead in the blue afternoon. He accepted a piece of my dark chocolate with a solemnity that felt ceremonial, breaking off a small square, and letting it melt on his tongue while he gazed out at the valley floor hazy with heat. We shared a silence for a while, the kind of silence that isn't awkward but full, watching a raven tilt on the wind, its shadow flickering across the rocks. He told me the ravens knew hum, they talked to me and I talk back and we understand each other well enough, and that the deer used his old trails. They let me be, I let them be, that's the whole arrangement. I didn't ask his story, where he came from, what he might be running from or toward, what his name had been in the world of roads and telephones. Those questions felt profane, a violation of the compact that had allowed him to appear at all. He was simply a man who had shed the world like a snake sheds a skin, growing a new one out of lichen and wind, and the slow patience of stone. After a few minutes, he stood without a word, tipped his walking stick in a small salute that might have been a blessing, and melted back into the brush with a quietness that seemed impossible for a creature his size. I listened for his footsteps but heard nothing, no crunch of leaves, no snap of twigs, just the wind and the distant caw of a raven who might have been reporting his passage. It was as if the mountain had sent a vision of what a human might become if they stayed still long enough to grow roots, and then called him back into its fold, before I could ask too many questions. 9. The Light on the Ridge. It was a moonless night on a remote overlook in the Nantahala National Forest, a rocky outcrop known for its unbroken view of the distant, dark silhouette of Brown Mountain, a ridge infamous for unexplained nocturnal lights that have been reported for centuries. I was with two friends, all of us skeptical. We were engineers and a biology graduate student, armed with rational explanations and a shared impatience for paranormal cliches, but willing to be wrong. We had hiked in with camp chairs, thermoses of coffee, and a night vision camera that immediately proved useless, its battery dying in the cold. We sat for hours, wrapped in sleeping bags, talking in low voices, watching the black silhouette of the mountain across the valley. We saw satellites tracing their slow, deliberate arcs, a few shooting stars leaving silver scratches on the dark, and the far-off rhythmic wink of a radio tower on a distant peak. We were about to pack it in, stiff and chilled and slightly disappointed, when I saw it. A single orb of pale, orange-yellow light lifted slowly from the slope of Brown Mountain, about a third of the way up. It rose vertically, gliding with a floaty, buoyant motion that was not like anything mechanical. No aircraft moves with that slow, hovering deliberation, that drifting quality that seemed almost purposeful. It hovered for perhaps 5 seconds, a steady point of light that seemed to pulse slightly, as if breathing. Then it simply vanished. Not faded, not drifted behind a ridge, winked out as if a switch had been thrown, an instantaneous transition from presence to absence. A few minutes later, another one appeared lower down, pulsed twice in a deliberate pattern, and disappeared just as abruptly. We watched for another hour, hardly breathing, seeing 4 more of these silent, impossible lights, some rising, some moving laterally, one splitting briefly into 2 before the twin orbs merged again and vanished. We ran through the explanations. Not aircraft, there were no navigation lights, no engine sounds, and the flight path was all wrong. Not distant car headlights on the Blue Ridge Parkway. The parkway closed hours ago and lay at a different angle entirely. Not marsh gas or ball lightning or any of the other pat explanations that get trotted out in skeptical literature. This was something the Cherokee called the lights of the dead, the spirits of warriors slain in an ancient battle, or according to other traditions, the spirits of women searching for their lost husbands. Modern researchers have studied the Brown Mountain lights for over a century. There are U.S. Geological Survey papers, physics theories, atmospheric plasma hypotheses, and none have provided a definitive answer. On that night, they were not a problem to be solved, but a gift of pure mystery, a reminder that the mountains still hold secrets that slip through the net of our comprehension. We drove home in a charged silence, each of us privately adjusting our inner map of the possible, the image of those floating, pulsing lights seared into our minds like afterimages from a dream. 10. The sound of silence after snow. A heavy, wet snow had fallen overnight in the high country of the cranberry wilderness, the kind that sticks to every twig and bends the rhododendron leaves into frozen green canoes, the kind that transforms the world into a single, unbroken plain of white. I strapped on snowshoes and broke trail into a realm that felt newly created, untouched, my tracks the first mark of human passage since the storm. There was no wind, no birdsong, no distant hum of human machinery. The snow was a soundproof blanket laid over the entire mountain. The only sound was the muffled crunch of my own footsteps, the creak of my snowshoe bindings, and the whisper of my breath turning to frost in front of my face, each exhalation a small cloud that dissipated into the crystalline air. I stopped in a small glade where a frozen creek curled between boulders, its summer voice completely silenced, the water frozen into twisted sculptures of ice that caught the pale morning light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. The silence was not empty. It was a physical substance, a held breath that seemed to be waiting for something. In that kind of quiet, you can hear your own body, the steady drum of your heartbeat, the tiny creaks of your joints, the soft rush of blood in your ears. I had come to these woods many times, but always in the lively chatter of the green seasons, when the forest is a busy, vocal place of bird calls and rustling leaves and the distant gossip of creeks. This was the mountain stripped down to its essential self, sleeping under a white blanket, dreaming in ice crystals, asking nothing of anyone. I stood there for a long while, the cold seeping through my layers and numbing my cheeks, the silence seeping into my soul with a gentleness that felt almost like a physical touch. A quote from an old Shaker hymn came to me, the one that Aaron Copland borrowed for Appalachian spring. "'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free." The snow had simplified the world into a single black and white note, and in that simplicity there was a freedom I hadn't realized I'd been craving, a release from the constant noise of notifications and news and the grinding static of modern consciousness. The encounter here was with pure absence, the absence of noise, of color, of the cluttered multiplicity of summer, of the endless demands of being a person in the world. It was an encounter with the deep, restorative quiet that pre-industrial humans knew as a constant companion, the quiet that is the natural baseline of the planet, and not a rare luxury to be sought out. When I finally turned back, my snowshoe tracks were the only mark of human passage in a vast, sleeping tapestry, and the forest offered no commentary on my presence, no judgment, no welcome, only the profound, healing sound of absolutely nothing at all, a silence so complete it felt like the mountain had briefly let me step outside of time.